For years, the English had learned to defend themselves. Standing firm became their greatest strength. The shield wall transformed into their ultimate weapon. But understanding did not come easily to the Vikings. They watched, they studied, they adapted. In the years between 815 and 820, something fundamental changed. Raiders evolved into soldiers. Disorganized forces became disciplined armies. When two shield walls collided on the battlefield, everything shifted. This is the story of what happened when English tactics met Viking innovation. This is the story of the moment when warfare transformed forever. This is the story of how the English learned that their greatest weapon was no longer unique. Let me take you back to the year 815. More than a decade had passed since the English began building their defenses. Warriors trained relentlessly. Formations grew tighter. Discipline increased. The shield wall had become their greatest strength. It had become their greatest hope. It had become the symbol of English resistance. Young men grew up knowing nothing but the shield wall. Fathers taught sons the proper stance. Commanders drilled their warriors hour after hour. The shield wall was not just a tactic. It was a way of life. It was the foundation of English survival. But the Vikings were learning too. Observation revealed English tactics. Study showed what worked and what failed. Adaptation followed. Direct assault did not work. Raiding parties could not break organized defenses. A new approach was needed. The Vikings realized they had to organize. They had to train. They had to form shield walls of their own. Some Viking leaders resisted this change. They believed in the old ways. They believed in speed and surprise. They believed that organization was weakness. But other leaders saw the future. They understood that England could not be conquered by raids alone. They understood that the English had learned to defend themselves. They understood that new tactics were necessary. In 815, a new Viking commander arrived on the coast. His name was Ivar. Unlike other Viking leaders, he possessed a different vision. Conquest interested him more than plunder. Understanding English tactics fascinated him. Learning their strategies consumed his thoughts. Ivar had studied the English extensively. He had learned about their organization. He had learned about their discipline. He had learned about their weapons. And he had decided to use everything he had learned against them. Ivar had also learned something else. He had learned that the Vikings needed to change. He had learned that raiding was no longer enough. He had learned that conquest required organization. Ivar brought with him something unprecedented. This was not a raiding party seeking treasure. This was not a group of warriors looking for quick plunder. This was an organized military force. Discipline characterized every movement. Strategy guided every decision. Shield walls formed their backbone. The Vikings had learned from their enemies. They had learned to organize. They had learned to stand together. They had learned to fight as one. Ivar had recruited warriors from across Scandinavia. He had trained them for months. He had taught them discipline. He had taught them to form shield walls. He had taught them to fight like soldiers, not like raiders. The result was something the English had never encountered before. A Viking army that was organized. A Viking force that was disciplined. A Viking military that could match the English. When Ivar's fleet arrived on the coast, the English prepared. Many invasions had come before. Many Viking forces had been defeated. Preparation had become routine. Organization came naturally. Defense was second nature. Yet nothing had prepared them for what was coming. They had never faced an organized Viking army. They had never encountered Vikings with shield walls. They had never seen discipline among the Norse warriors. English scouts brought reports of something strange. The Vikings were not scattered. They were not raiding randomly. They were organized. They were moving in formation. They were acting like an army. The English commanders were puzzled. This was different. This was something new. This required a different response. Ivar landed his forces on the shore. Warriors marched inland in formation. Supplies followed in organized columns. Scouts ranged ahead. Messengers coordinated movements. This was not a raid. This was an invasion. The English watched carefully. They organized their own forces. They formed their shield walls. They prepared for something new. The English king gathered his commanders. They discussed strategy. They discussed tactics. They discussed what they knew about this new Viking force. Some commanders wanted to attack immediately. Some wanted to wait and see. Some wanted to negotiate. The king listened to all opinions. Then he made his decision. They would prepare for battle. They would organize their forces. They would form their shield walls. They would be ready. The two armies met on a plain in the middle of England. English warriors formed their traditional wall. Viking forces arranged themselves in similar fashion. For the first time, two organized military forces faced each other directly. For the first time, two shield walls stood opposite one another. For the first time, the Vikings were not raiders. For the first time, they were warriors organized like the English. The sight was shocking. English commanders could not believe what they were seeing. The Vikings had shield walls. The Vikings had organization. The Vikings had discipline. Everything the English had learned about the Vikings was wrong. The Vikings had changed. The Vikings had adapted. The Vikings had learned. The battle began. English warriors advanced steadily. Viking forces moved forward with equal determination. The ground trembled beneath their feet. Tension filled the air. The moment approached. Everything would change. Messengers rode between the two armies. One last chance for negotiation. One last chance for peace. But both sides had decided. War was the only option. Peace was not possible. The armies advanced toward each other. The shield walls collided with tremendous force. Warriors fell on both sides. Blood soaked the earth. The crash of shields deafened everyone nearby. Screams of wounded men filled the air. But something was different. This was not a Viking force breaking against an English wall. This was two shield walls colliding with equal power. This was two organized armies fighting for dominance. The impact was so great that warriors on both sides were knocked backward. The shield walls held. Neither side broke. Neither side ran. Both sides stood firm. Hours passed. The English pushed forward. The Vikings pushed back. Neither side gave ground easily. Neither side was willing to surrender. The battle was fierce. The battle was brutal. The battle was unlike anything the English had ever experienced. Warriors on both sides were exhausted. Warriors on both sides were wounded. Warriors on both sides were fighting for their lives. The sun moved across the sky. Hours became half a day. Half a day became a full day. Still the battle continued. English warriors were shocked. Victory had seemed certain. Breaking the Viking shield wall had seemed inevitable. The Norse forces would flee, but the Vikings did not run. They stood firm. They fought with discipline. They fought with organization. They fought like soldiers, not like raiders. English commanders realized they had underestimated their enemy. They had thought the Vikings would break. They had thought the Vikings would flee. They had thought victory would be easy. They were wrong. The Vikings were strong. The Vikings were organized. The Vikings were warriors. The Viking warriors were equally surprised. Collapse of the English shield wall had seemed certain. Victory had seemed assured. But the English did not break. They held their ground. They fought with determination. They fought with courage. They fought like warriors defending their homeland. Viking commanders realized they had underestimated their enemy. They had thought the English would break. They had thought the English would flee. They had thought victory would be easy. They were wrong. The English were strong. The English were organized. The English were warriors. Hour after hour, the battle continued. Neither side was winning. Neither side was losing. The battle was a stalemate. The two shield walls were equally matched. The two armies were equally strong. The two forces were equally determined. The battle raged on through the day. As afternoon turned to evening, both sides were exhausted. But neither side was willing to stop. Neither side was willing to retreat. The battle continued. As the sun began to set, something changed. English warriors pushed forward with renewed energy. The Viking shield wall began to crack. Norse warriors began to fall back. The English saw their opportunity. They pushed harder. They drove forward with all their might. The Viking shield wall began to break. English warriors sensed victory. They pushed even harder. They drove even faster. The Viking shield wall was collapsing. But then something unexpected occurred. The Vikings did not flee. They did not panic. They reformed their shield wall. They regrouped. They charged at the English with renewed fury. The English were shocked. They had expected the Vikings to run. They had not expected the Vikings to regroup and attack again. The Vikings came at them like a wave. The Vikings came at them with all their remaining strength. The Vikings came at them with fury and determination. The battle resumed with even greater intensity. The two shield walls collided again. The impact was even more tremendous than before. Warriors fell on both sides. Blood soaked the ground. The clash of shields was deafening. The screams of wounded men filled the air. The battle raged on. This time the Vikings pushed forward. The English shield wall began to crack. English warriors began to fall back. The Vikings saw their opportunity. They pushed harder. They drove forward with all their might. The English shield wall began to break. But then the English did something unexpected. They did not flee. They did not panic. They reformed their shield wall. They regrouped. They charged at the Vikings with renewed fury. The battle continued through the night. The two armies fought in darkness. The clash of shields continued. The screams of wounded men continued. The battle raged on. Neither side was willing to give up. Neither side was willing to surrender. The battle was a test of will. The battle was a test of strength. The battle was a test of determination. Warriors fought knowing they might die. Warriors fought knowing their comrades were dying. Warriors fought because they had no other choice. As dawn broke, exhaustion set in. Warriors on both sides were wounded. Warriors on both sides were tired. Warriors on both sides were ready to stop fighting. But neither side wanted to be the first to retreat. Neither side wanted to admit defeat. The battle continued. Messengers rode between the armies again. One last chance for negotiation. One last chance for peace. But both sides refused. The battle continued. Finally, as the sun rose higher in the sky, something changed. English warriors pushed forward again. The Viking shield wall began to crack again. Norse warriors began to fall back again. But this time, they did not regroup. This time, they did not come back. This time, they retreated. The Vikings fell back toward their ships. The English pursued them. The English chased them toward the sea. The English drove them back to their vessels. Ivar escaped. He managed to reach his ship. He managed to sail away. But many of his warriors did not escape. Many were killed. Many were captured. Many were left behind on the beach. The English had won the battle. The English had defeated the Viking army. The English had proven that they could defeat an organized military force. But the victory was different from earlier triumphs. Earlier victories had been easy. Earlier victories had come quickly. Earlier victories had been against raiders and plunderers. But this victory had been hard. This victory had taken all night. This victory had been against an organized army. This victory had been against soldiers who fought like the English fought. The English warriors were exhausted. They were wounded. They were traumatized. But they had won. The English understood what had happened. The Vikings had learned. The Vikings had organized. The Vikings had formed shield walls. The Vikings were no longer just raiders. The Vikings were soldiers. The Vikings were warriors. The Vikings were an organized military force. The English realized that their greatest weapon was no longer unique. The English realized that the Vikings had learned their tactics. The English realized that they needed to adapt. The English realized that they needed to develop new strategies. The English realized that the future would be different. The English realized that this was just the beginning. In the years that followed, the English began to change their approach. New tactics emerged. Forces were organized differently. Preparation intensified. The English realized that the shield wall alone was insufficient. Cavalry became necessary. Archers were recruited. A more sophisticated military force developed. The English began to think about strategy differently. They began to think about terrain. They began to think about supply lines. They began to think about logistics. They began to think like professional soldiers, not just warriors. The Vikings also changed their approach. Organization improved. Shield walls became more effective. Recruitment increased. A longer war was anticipated. quick conquest was no longer expected. More sophisticated tactics were developed. The Vikings began to think about strategy differently. They began to think about establishing settlements. They began to think about creating a permanent presence in England. They began to think about the long term, not just the immediate conquest. By 820, the nature of the conflict had transformed. It was no longer a simple conflict between raiders and defenders. It was a conflict between two organized military forces. It was a conflict between two armies. It was a conflict between two nations. The conflict would last for generations. The conflict would define the future of England. The conflict would lead to the eventual unification of England. The conflict would lead to the development of English military strategy. The conflict would lead to the eventual defeat of the Vikings. What emerged from these years was a new understanding of warfare. Both sides had learned that organization mattered more than courage alone. Both sides had learned that discipline could overcome raw aggression. Both sides had learned that strategy was as important as strength. The English could no longer rely solely on the shield wall. They needed cavalry. They needed archers. They needed a more sophisticated military force. The Vikings could no longer rely on surprise and ferocity. They needed organization. They needed discipline. They needed to think strategically. In the decades to come, the English would develop cavalry. The English would develop archers. The English would develop a more sophisticated military force. The English would learn to combine the shield wall with other tactics. The English would learn to use terrain to their advantage. The English would learn to use strategy as well as strength. The English would learn to fight like the Vikings fought. The English would learn to adapt and overcome. The English would eventually unify under a single king. The English would eventually create a nation. The English would eventually defeat the Vikings. The Vikings also continued to develop. Organization improved further. Recruitment continued. Preparation for a longer war intensified. Tactics were refined. Learning from the English continued. Adaptation and innovation followed. The Vikings would establish settlements in England. The Vikings would create the Danelaw. The Vikings would become part of English history. The Vikings would eventually be integrated into English society. The collision of the two shield walls in 815 was a turning point. It was the moment when the conflict changed fundamentally. It was the moment when both sides realized that they were facing a worthy opponent. It was the moment when both sides realized that the conflict would be long and difficult. It was the moment when both sides began to develop more sophisticated military strategies. It was the moment when everything shifted. What both sides learned in these years would echo through the centuries. The English would eventually unify under a single king. The Vikings would eventually be defeated. But the lessons learned in these battles would shape English military strategy forever. The respect earned on these battlefields would influence how both sides fought for generations to come. The understanding that emerged from this collision would transform warfare itself. The aftermath of this battle was profound. English warriors returned to their homes changed. They had fought against an organized Viking army. They had fought against warriors who matched their own discipline. They had fought against soldiers who understood strategy. The experience transformed how they thought about warfare. Young warriors who had grown up believing the shield wall was invincible learned a hard lesson. The shield wall was powerful, but it was not enough. The shield wall was effective, but it could be matched. The shield wall was their greatest weapon, but they needed more. English commanders gathered to discuss what they had learned. They talked about the Vikings' organization. They talked about the Vikings' discipline. They talked about the Vikings' strategy. They realized that the Vikings had studied them carefully. The Vikings had learned from watching English tactics. The Vikings had adapted. The Vikings had changed their approach. This realization was both frightening and motivating. It was frightening because it meant the Vikings were becoming more dangerous. It was motivating because it meant the English could learn too. It meant the English could adapt. It meant the English could develop new tactics. The English king made a decision. He would invest in new military technology. He would recruit cavalry. He would train archers. He would develop a more sophisticated military force. He would not rely on the shield wall alone. He would create an army that could match the Vikings in every way. This decision would take years to implement. This decision would require resources. This decision would require commitment. But it was necessary. The future of England depended on it. The Vikings also made decisions. Ivar escaped, but he had learned something important. The English were stronger than he had thought. The English were more organized than he had expected. The English were warriors, not just defenders. Ivar realized that conquest would take longer than he had anticipated. Ivar realized that he needed more warriors. Ivar realized that he needed better tactics. Ivar began to plan his next invasion. Ivar began to recruit more warriors. Ivar began to develop new strategies. Ivar understood that this was a long-term conflict. Ivar understood that quick victory was not possible. Ivar understood that he needed to prepare for a prolonged war. The message spread throughout Scandinavia. The Vikings had faced an organized English army. The Vikings had fought against warriors who matched their own discipline. The Vikings had learned that England could not be conquered easily. This message attracted new Viking leaders. This message attracted ambitious warriors. This message attracted men who wanted to be part of something larger than themselves. More Vikings came to England. More Viking armies arrived. More Viking warriors joined the invasion. The conflict would intensify. The conflict would expand. The conflict would eventually define the future of England. In the years that followed, there would be many more battles. There would be victories and defeats on both sides. There would be moments when it seemed the Vikings would conquer England. There would be moments when it seemed the English would drive the Vikings out. There would be moments of hope and moments of despair. But through it all, both sides would remember the moment when the shield walls met. Both sides would remember the moment when everything shifted. Both sides would remember that they were facing a worthy opponent. Both sides would remember that the conflict would be long and difficult. The collision of the two shield walls in 815 was more than just a battle. It was a turning point in history. It was the moment when the Vikings stopped being raiders and became conquerors. It was the moment when the English stopped being defenders and became warriors. It was the moment when both sides realized that the future would be determined by strategy, organization, and discipline, not just courage and strength. It was the moment when everything changed.